Hey class, it's Jessica Vickers, and I am here with Ryan Carey. She is a family therapist, and this week we're talking about homeostasis within the family and how substance use can impact homeostasis. So I wanted to bring in Ryan, who is an expert and works with a lot of families, and just get her take on some of the family members she's worked with that may um, have been impacted by their loved one using substances. So, Brian, can you tell me about your a little bit about your work and what you do and the types of clients that you see?
Sure. So I work with patients who are in residential treatment. So it's a 28-day program. And while they are with us on campus, we reach out through a virtual setting to family members to offer education and guidance. A term we use is family members working their own recovery because we know that the more education people can have about substance use disorder, the more insight they can have to their own perceptions, understanding, and behaviors, the better off they are and the more successful our patients are. So, if family members are actively engaging in services, we see higher success rates, longer terms of sobriety with our patients.
It's wonderful. So, can you tell me a little bit about one of the things we learned this week is that addiction is a family disease, that it
Correct.
doesn't just impact the one person who's seeking treatment. Can you tell me what your experience is with that and how you perceive that to be true or not true?
Sure. So it's talking about homeostasis using a systematic approach. You look at if one part of the system isn't functioning well, it impacts all the other parts. So a lot of the times when someone is in active use, other parts of the system kind of go into a survival mode to accommodate for needs. So maybe you have a spouse who's, feels like they're a single parent, or you have somebody who is feeling frustrated and they fall into like this persecutor role. So even though it's a level of dysfunction, that dysfunction is their homeostasis. So when you ask one part of the system, say the patient in treatment, working on themselves to improve, if the loved one remains in that persecutor role or in this dysfunctional role, it will disrupt the ability to create a healthy homeostasis. So that's why we tell family members substance use disorder doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It impacts all other angles, all other parts of the system. So it's really important for family members to say, what do I bring to the table? What's good? What's helpful? What are maladaptive behaviors that I honestly developed while I was in survival mode trying to understand this disease? Because reality is with substance use disorder, there's a lot of stigma, and society as a whole doesn't really understand or view it as a disease. So it makes it hard for family members to say, how can I help my loved one in a healthy way? Because it's viewed as a behavioral problem, not a true disease of the brain. So even being able to kind of pump the brakes with loved ones and educate them about the disease and give them grace and the opportunity to learn about it and learn about themselves is helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome that we have programs that can help the family members as well. I know with my experience when I was treating patients at a residential level of care, sometimes I would talk to family members that would become a little resentful because
Mhm.
their loved one was here and they were doing a lot of work and they were getting a lot of attention and care while the family member was at home, perhaps taking on additional responsibilities. Maybe they, had to start taking care of kids or, driving here and driving there. And sometimes they become resentful. How do you approach that with the family members?
Well, I think first hearing them and validating that experience, that's their reality. We kind of have to be able to meet them where they're at, but also encourage them to say, okay, this is your reality. How are you coping? How are you healing? And how can we tweak that? I think a lot of the times too, family members, if they really look at their lives from a holistic approach, are you engaging in the community? Do you have support services? Because sometimes I've had family members come to me and their loved one's doing well, they're in recovery, but they kind of get jealous. They're like, well, they have a sponsor, they have friends now, they're going skiing, and I still feel like I'm babysitting. So it's like saying, okay, well, maybe now's the time for you to ask for help or engage in different services and work through some of that resentment. But I also think it's really important too to be able to validate where they are at and understand, their emotions, their feelings, and maybe why they develop such coping mechanisms.
Yeah. I've also talked to families that, family members, and it's interesting you brought up the jealousy. um, sometimes it feels almost as if they become resentful at the treatment center because the treatment center was able to reach their loved one in a way that they haven't been able to. For example, if a spouse has been, if they've been married for 30 years and, the patient hasn't been able to quit drinking for, 25 of those years, comes to treatment for 28 days and is doing well, sometimes it feels that they're almost resentful at the treatment program that somehow they weren't enough for their loved one to quit. Have you ever run across that or come across that?
Yeah, of course. And also I'll hear spouses in session say, I said the same thing that Ryan said. And I always, allow grace, but also say one thing that treatment centers offer, one is expertise. Two, our relationship. We offer distance. I don't have that emotional connection. My emotions aren't as spiked when we have conversations because I'm not living in it. I have the ability to kind of look through things above. So I encourage family members to try to do that in small spaces. But the reality is, when emotions are high, it is hard to hear. A lot of the times, too, I feel like when people are trying to communicate, they miss what people are asking for. Is it an emotional conversation? Do I need you to just validate my feelings, or is this a
Mhm.
conversation where I'm offering or seeking advice? A lot of the times, too, family members, they're in survival mode, and sometimes they say things that can trigger someone to become defensive. For example, like, you're doing this, or you drink all the time, and that impacts me. And the message is lost. So I encourage people to use things like I statements, being able to say, I feel this way, or I have anxiety about this, so that the true message that you're trying to convey isn't being lost. And I also think family members that have loved ones who are inpatient, we have to realize that this is intense. This is crisis. So we have to be able to understand that people have been trying to survive. And being in survival mode, people can kind of lose themselves in who they really are. So I think being able to understand that helps me as a clinician
Mhm.
work with families.
Yeah, validation is so important. I've heard you say that a couple times, and
Yeah.
I think sometimes that's all is needed. That's all that's needed on our end is just validating how the family feels.
Hmm.
Um, and then I've seen a lot of times where spouses or family members are very resistant to making any changes themselves, saying things like, "Well, it's my husband that has the problem. Why should I go to meetings?" Or "It's my daughter that has the issue. Why do I need to change?"
Right. That all goes back into being able to own what you bring to the table and what you don't. So a lot of the times when we have loved ones who are suffering from any disease, we tend to fall what we call into the drama triangle. So a rescuer role where we're trying to help overcompensate, or a persecutor role where we become mad, like, why aren't you changing? Why can't you do this? Or the victim role is, I give up. I'm really suffering. This sucks. And it's kind of a level of self-pity that people have. So we talk about those things, and how can you become, instead of rescuing, healthy support, instead of persecuting, being a coach or offering guidance. Hey, I'm seeing that, every time you go out with your friends, it seems to be a trigger for poor behavior. That makes me worry. What are your thoughts? Someone is more open to hearing that than you're doing this or you're doing that. So I try to stray away from what family members are doing right or wrong, but encourage them to say what's working and what's healthy. So how can we do that more? Um, but I think the reality of it is too, is it's really easy to focus on the person with like the obvious problem. It's hard for family members to kind of sit back and own what they're doing, especially when it is in crisis, because crisis is a feeling of I'm not in control.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation about the stigma of addiction and
Hmm.
how it's more like a bad behavior as opposed to a disease, and feeling like, well, if this person is displaying the bad behavior, they're the one that needs to change. And if they change, everything will be fine. When in reality, it's about the whole family.
Right. It's more than just being sober. And that's what I try to tell family members, because I do hear that a lot. Well, if he stopped drinking, I wouldn't be yelling at him.
Mm,
But if he stopped drinking, would you trust right away? Or if she stopped drinking, would you trust right away? Especially if it's as a parent and that it's their child. How are you going to navigate that natural parental instinct to make sure your kid's okay? But
right.
micromanaging isn't helpful. Constantly monitoring or trying to control someone else is impossible. So you're going to exhaust yourself. And it's hard to sit with that.
Yeah.
And it's a general lack of education. So many people come, they're like, I've tried to exhaust all efforts. I don't know what else to do. What is out there? People don't know about Al-Anon or Smart Recovery. So reaching out to services, we're always happy to help and share these resources are available.
Yeah. That's really, I mean, it is great, and we need more services, I think, for families, to help the families navigate the situation as well. I had one student mention that they were interested in learning how to help support their spouse, not only in the early recovery process, but also in the long-term recovery process. What are your suggestions for somebody who has a loved one who is trying to get clean, and how they can initially support, and then also how do they maintain that support without maybe crossing that enabling boundary?
I think that's a really challenging question, especially to working inpatient. We only have our patients for 28 days. We only work with our family members a handful of times. So it's a matter of sometimes breaking things down to a day at a time. Where am I at? What do I need in this moment? Especially in early recovery. Patients are vulnerable in early recovery, but so are family members because old habits are strong. We're habitual creatures. So I think being able to acknowledge that it's about progress, not perfection, is key. But also realizing right now in early recovery, you might need more rigid boundaries. You might need those weekly check ins. Once a loved one gets in a groove and a routine for their own recovery, it might be a good time to do couples counseling so that way you have an expert. Because the reality is, you can't do recovery alone, not as a patient, not as a family member. So, reaching out to the experts, reaching out to people who have been in recovery long term. And it goes back to, I say this all the time, what is healthy and what's going to work. As a counselor, it's not our job to tell people what to do. Our job is to act as an agent of change and encourage people to have autonomy and make decisions that they feel are aligned to their values. One thing I say a lot to family members is there's so much going on. There's triggers, there's learning, there's being uncomfortable, trying new things. You don't want to lose yourself in it. Who am I? I'm Ryan. I like to be kind. I like to help others. So when I fall into a persecutor role or I snap, that doesn't align with my values. And it really starts with two, understanding what can I control? I can't control what you do, but I can control how I respond. And I can try to respond and not react. Um, so I think it's really just a dance. And at the end of the day, life is hard and
Yeah.
we need to lean on people.
Yeah, I was posting a discussion reply yesterday, and I was talking about how change happens all the time. It's
Mhm.
nature's way of surviving different, external forces coming our way, and I think that's true with families, and going through the recovery process, that we're constantly trying to find that homeostasis within that functional unit, and that it's change is going to happen, and we have to be okay with sort of that disruption, and feeling uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it kind of goes back to what we started with, like that level of dysfunction that you've had for a while, your old cycle, it feels normal because it's been your homeostasis, it's been your normal for so long. So when you're in early sobriety, it's all shooken up and you got to find your new groove. You got to allow areas and opportunities for growth and error. Relapses is one of the things that is unfortunately a symptom, a part of this disease. So, one thing I encourage family members to do is to have a game plan, have an understanding of what expectations are, even if they are, I don't know in this moment, I need more time to think about it, or it may be situational. But know your boundaries, know your limits, and set yourself up for success.